And welcome back. In this video, I wanted to guide you through some of the most popular Python libraries that can be used for a variety of things. So we're going to talk about some libraries you can use to interact with databases, some that you've already seen and some that you haven't, to look at web development, a couple to do communications, like sending emails or SMS texts, a couple for GUI design for graphical user interfaces, like desktop apps, a bunch of them that can be used for data science and that are very popular, and then some for computer vision, and we're going to look at a couple of development tools as well you can use to make your life a bit easier when you're working with Python. For databases, you've already looked at SQLite 3, which comes with Python, and you can use SQLite 3 to interact with SQLite databases. There's another library that is actually fairly similar to SQLite 3 in some cases, although it's more advanced, and that's called psycopg2. Psycopg2 can be used to interact with Postgres databases as opposed to SQLite databases. Postgres databases are also relational databases like SQLite databases are, but they are much more advanced and they let you do more things and generally they perform better, but they're also a bit more complicated. Similarly to psycopg2, you've also got IOPG, which is the asynchronous version of psycopg2. It lets you do things like async connections to a database and sort of run other code while you wait for data to come back from the database and things like that. So if you're looking into high-performance PostgreSQL database connections from within Python and your application is asynchronous, I recommend you use IOPG. And then you've also got SQL Alchemy. SQL Alchemy is a sort of a different beast altogether. It can be used to connect to SQLite or Postgres or MySQL or Oracle or indeed any other type of database. And it sort of wraps the entire database connection in a different format. So what SQL Alchemy allows you to do, and we're going to look at this later on in the course, in this section, what SQL Alchemy allows you to do is define classes, and each class has a table and a bunch of columns, and then whenever you create an object, that sort of creates its corresponding row in the database. So it lets you work with Python only and not really worry about the database. It just gets taken care of for you. This is known as an object relational mapping, and SQL Alchemy is the most popular one in Python. For web development libraries, you've already seen Flask. I really like Flask. It's a very simple framework that nonetheless is very extensible and quite powerful. But a lot of people have heard of Django, which is sort of the big brother of web development in Python. And Django is a really powerful web framework, but it's also quite complicated. If you want to start learning learning Django, there's a lot of stuff you have to learn about how Django does things and what structure it wants you to follow in your code and how it wants you to handle X and Y and so forth. So the learning curve is much steeper. This is why I prefer Flask, especially when you're starting out. So Django can be really useful for making specific types of web applications because Django gives you a lot of things out of the box when you can just tell Django to create an app for you and it will give you an app with a bunch of things in it, like user authentication, an administration panel, and so forth. But then, of course, that code is not code you've written, so it can limit you in what you can do to change it. You sort of have to follow its structure. As well as Flask and Django, you've got a bunch of asynchronous frameworks for web development. These are very powerful, but they are also more complicated than Flask, particularly IOHTTP that we've already seen, on Tornado. They are pretty challenging to really grasp, but they are quite powerful. They give you a lot of stuff you can do. For example, IOHTTP, as we know, gives you a client as well that you can use to make asynchronous requests, as well as do web development with it. Sanic and Quart are two new frameworks that actually don't have a lot of popularity yet, but they have been developed to be simple frameworks for web development that are asynchronous. They very much are similar to Flask in that regard, but they are asynchronous. Qt particularly actually was recently suggested to me by one of the students, and it is an exact mimic or copy of Flask, but made asynchronous, and as such it works with a lot of the Flask extensions. Flask is a very popular framework because of the extensions that sort of enhance Flask's power. Sanic doesn't have those extensions, and as such is a bit more limited in that regard. So if you want to do asynchronous web development, maybe look into Qt if you're already familiar with Flask. There's also a very popular web development framework in Python called Bottle that is the precursor to Flask and is another simple framework. I can't say much about it though because I've never actually used it, but I know that it exists and a lot of people do know about it. For communications, and this is something we're going to look at throughout the rest of this section, you've got smtplib that comes built in with Python. This allows you to connect to an SMTP server. These are normally email servers like Gmail and so forth, and they let you authenticate on those servers with a username and password, and then send emails from that server using your account. So you could use smtplib to log into your Gmail account and send an email through your account. So it can be really powerful, but also slightly limiting in some cases because you have to send the email using your own Gmail account. As such, we have Mailgun. Mailgun is another breed of email sending libraries. You've got a bunch of others like SendGrid that do the same job. And these essentially give you an email service that you can send emails from without requiring that you use your own personal account. So they give you an email address and you can send emails from there. It also has a nice API that you can interact with in order to send those emails, and we're going to look at this shortly. You've also got a very popular and very powerful library and indeed a company called Twilio. And Twilio does tools for communication, and they have a lot of ways of talking to their products using Python, and they can do things like send text messages, SMS. They also do things like call center products and a bunch of other stuff like real-time chats and things like that, and you can interact with all of those using Python. So if you are thinking of making some sort of chat application or you want to send text messages, look into Twilio. They are really quite good, and the pricing is fairly reasonable. It's not terribly expensive. If you have a small company and you're sending a small amount of text messages or chat sessions and things like that, it's actually pretty cheap. If you are a large company that's sending a lot of text messages or chat sessions, the price actually goes down as you increase your volume, so it ends up still being fairly reasonable. And also, I've spoken with them in a corporate setting, and they're willing to play around with the price as well. So definitely something worth considering if that's something you want to build. For GUI design, which stands for Graphical User Interface, this is something that a lot of people actually don't know Python can do. For a lot of people, Python is a sort of data science and web development language, and that's it. But actually, you've got some graphical user interface libraries that you can use to make desktop applications. And the most popular one, or I'd say maybe the best one, is called Kivy. And Kivy can be used for designing graphical user interfaces, but also for making games. Now, I haven't looked too in-depth into Kivy. I've not really used it in a professional setting, but I have read through their documentation and some of their guides, and it actually looks fairly straightforward. Not too easy, but it looks doable to make games and graphical user interfaces using Kivy. Whereas, if you look into Ginter, I don't even know how to say this word, it's not so simple. This is the predecessor, it's a much older library used for making graphical user interfaces, but it's not as straightforward. So if you want to build graphical user interfaces, I definitely recommend you look into Kivy. For data science, you've got a bunch of libraries that can be used for scientific computing and sort of advanced mathematics and things like that. You've got NumPy and SciPy, which are used for just that. These are things that allow you to work with matrices and vectors and things like that. And again, I'm not much of a scientist, so don't know much about these things. But they are the staple in the data science community. So if you've done any data science, you probably have seen these already, and if not, you definitely want to look into them. You've also got pandas and matplotlib. These are, again, used in data science very extensively. Matplotlib particularly, also outside of data science, used for creating graphs. So if you want to make like bar charts or line charts and things like that with Python, matplotlib is a good way of doing that. Also, a popular thing in data science are Jupyter notebooks. This is not really a library in Python as much as a tool that you can use to create a notebook, essentially just written notes, and you can embed within that notebook Python code. And not only that, but you can run bits of that Python code within the notebook. So if you're taking notes for a course like this one, it can be useful to create your own Jupyter notebook, take notes, and write the code that we teach you in these lectures into the notebook. And then whenever you go back to it, you can run the different code excerpts for the lecture without having to search through your files and many folders and things like that. So a pretty useful tool, but not something I've used very extensively. And of course, there are many other tools that use Python in data science, such as TensorFlow, which is not really a library per se, but still uses Python. For computer vision, it's not really something I'd recommend using Python for necessarily. I'm sure there are better ways of doing computer vision than with a language that only runs on one thread. But nonetheless, you've got OpenCV and SimpleCV. OpenCV is a large behemoth of computer vision. SimpleCV is a wrapper around it that makes it a bit simpler. So if you want to do computer vision in a sort of small scale, for example, make your application able to recognize faces and things like that, use SimpleCV. For development tools that we are going to look at in this section as well, you've got pylint, which is a linter. Linters, essentially, you can run them and give them one of your Python files, and it will tell you if you messed up. That's essentially it. If you've got some unused variables, or maybe you forgot to import something, or you forgot to add a comment somewhere, pylint is one of the family of linters in Python. This is the most popular one, the one I'd recommend using, and it's really helpful. It tells you when you messed up or when you've done something that you shouldn't do, and it tells you how to fix it most of the time. So a great thing to include in your workflow. We're going to look at how to use pylint soon. You've also got Flake 8, yapf, and black. These are formatters. So what they do is you can run them on a Python file and it will reformat it, add spaces and new lines where required to make your file more readable. Now, I always recommend you make your own files readable, but it can be useful to run through a formatter after you've made your file so that it always has the same style. You know, if you're working with someone else and you like putting spaces around an equal sign, and they like putting the equal sign stuck to the variable, I don't like that, but hey, some people do, then you can run both pieces of code through a formatter and they'll end up looking similar. So the style will be consistent and you won't hate each other for using different styles. We're going to look at this in the section, but if you want to read a bit more, you can go over to our blog and we've got a link there on handy Python development tools. This is going to be linked in the resources section of this lecture as well, so feel free to give it a click and have a wee read at the blog post. Finally, something we didn't mention at the start, but there are a lot of IDEs, or integrated development environments, you can use with Python. The most popular one, the one we've been using, is PyCharm. PyCharm is made by JetBrains, and it's probably the most powerful IDE you can use in Python. It has a lot of nice features, like run configurations, which allow you to run many different things from within PyCharm. It's got things like database connection handlers. It's got a built-in debugger that you can use to step through your code, and that's extremely powerful and really handy. And of course, it sort of does everything you need for Python. However, it can be a bit large. It can be a bit cumbersome. It can be quite slow to start up and to do things like searching and things like that. Also, if you open very large files with PyCharm, it can sometimes struggle. So a very popular thing to do is to have PyCharm for your sort of normal development flow, and when you require those more advanced pieces of functionality, but then also have what I like to call a glorified text editor when you want to make quick changes or you have a small project that you don't really need the power of PyCharm for. And in those cases, I like using Visual Studio Code, which is also an integrated development environment, an IDE, but it's much more sort of toned down. It doesn't do as much for you, and it can be a little bit trickier to set up nicely, but then it's fast, it's snappy. You can do basically anything you want with it, and it looks really nice as well. So I like Visual Studio Code. Some people like to use Atom or Sublime Text. These are three sort of what I call glorified text editors, and you can try them and give them a go as well. One of the great things about these three text editors is that you can change them very easily to suit what you like. So you can sort of change the themes, the colors, the way tabs show up, the icons, and everything about them, normally using cascading style sheets to do that, CSS. But of course, if you want to learn more about IDEs in Python and what sort of things you can do, we've got also a blog post, part of our 100 Days of Python series, that you can look at and goes in depth into why I think using PyCharm is the best thing to do, and sort of a few other options as well in case you want to have a look. So that's it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed this brief walk through some of the most important Python libraries out there. Let's go into the next one, so I'll see you there. Hi and welcome back. In this video we're going to look at pylint and what it is and how you can use it. What I've done is I've created a new project here in PyCharm, and I'm going to show you some code that pylint would complain about. So I'm going to create a file called app.py, and then we're going to do something like app is Flask name. If name equals main, app.run. So you can see that there are a couple of mistakes in this code, I'm sure. First of all, we've got Flask here, but we haven't imported Flask at the top of the file. And we also forgot to put our colon after the if statement. So this is not valid Python code exactly, but PyCharm realizes that we probably wanted to write Python code because our file ends in .py. And therefore, instead of just saying, this is complete gibberish, it says, you may have made a couple of mistakes. Of course, maybe we didn't make a couple of mistakes, and maybe this is another programming language that is very similar to Python, that isn't actually Python, and this would be fine. But under the assumption that we are coding in Python, this has a couple of problems in it, which is that we've forgotten to import Flask, or rather, Flask is something that Python doesn't know what it is. It could be a variable. For example, we could, of course, define Flask here to be something else. And then it wouldn't complain about Flask not existing. It would complain about, you're calling this using the brackets, but this is a string, so it doesn't know what you're doing. So anyway, this is the current problem is that Flask is not defined. That means we've either forgotten to import it or we've forgotten to define it. And also there's a clear problem here, which is that we've forgotten a colon. And PyCharm tells you, you've forgotten a colon here. So PyCharm has a way, somehow, of determining that these two things here are problems, right? This is a computer program. As such, it must have some sort of other program or some code inside PyCharm that tells us that these two things are problems. And PyCharm has its own way of doing this, but there are more standard ways of doing this outside of PyCharm. There are ways of finding out problems within a file outside of PyCharm, and that's what a linter is for. A linter essentially goes through your file and applies a bunch of rules, and if any of your lines fail that rule, it says, there's a problem here. In this case, it would go through these files and it would say Flask is not defined, and then it would go through this one and say you're missing a colon there. So let's go ahead into a terminal, and we're going to install the most popular linter in Python, and we're going to run it through this file, and we're going to see what it says. Let's open up a terminal just now. We've got a terminal here, And the first thing we're going to do is we are going to navigate to the folder that contains our file that we've just written. So if you remember, we are going to do cd, and then we're going to type out the path that will take us to our folder. So in my case, that's in Dropbox, Teclado, Courses, Complete Python Course, Section 18, that's where we are now. And then we're in Video Code, Pylint, and End. So this is the path to my project. And notice how the project is called End. That's just for me to structure the code for the course a bit better. Then if we type ls, or dir if you're in Windows, you'll see that you've got app.py in here. So this is where our file exists in our disk. You can, of course, navigate to this path using a visual or graphical explorer like Windows Explorer or Finder, but in order to run the linter, we're going to need the terminal. So let's navigate using the terminal and then install pylint. If you only have one version of Python installed, i.e. you've never installed Python other than a single version, you're going to do pip install pylint. If you have multiple versions of Python installed, make sure to select the right one with pip. So that may be either pip3, if you have two versions of Python installed, one Python 2 and one Python 3, or it may even be pip 3.6 if you have multiple versions of Python 3 installed. We've gone through this earlier on in the course, so again, just a brief reminder here. In my case, I'm going to install pylint using Python 3.6 because that's the latest version of Python in which pylint works. At time of recording, pylint did not work in Python 3.7. So just something to keep in mind. It's possible that by the time you're watching this, it already does work. So we're going to do pip 3.6 install pylint. And in my case, it's going to tell me it's already satisfied because I've already got it installed. But if you don't have it installed, it'll tell you the progress and eventually will install it. The next thing you want to do is type out which pylint. And that, because when you install pylint using pip, it's actually going to put an executable program in your path. So you will be able to do which pylint, and this pylint here is the pylint program that we can now run. And if here you get, program not found, or you don't get anything, then make sure that pylint has been installed correctly, and make sure that the 3.6/bin Python folder is in your path. Again, we looked at this earlier on in the course. I believe it was section 13. So just go back if you need to remind yourself as to how this worked. But if you get something here when you type which pylint, which by the way, I'm not sure it works on Windows, but nonetheless, if this works, or if you can just type pylint and you get something out, that means that pylint is working, it's installed correctly, and what you get out when you type pylint is just a help, sort of telling you how it works and how you can run it and so forth. For the majority of your runs, you won't need all of these options. All you'll have to do is pylint and then give it your app. So in this case, I'm going to type pylint space app.py, and it tells me the problems that are in the file. So here it says no config file found, so it's using a default configuration, and then it's saying in line 3 there is invalid syntax. It's saying syntax error. So what we can do is we can go ahead and open up the line 3 and see what happens there. And indeed, notice that it says line 3 syntax error. The fact that you've seen a syntax error in line 3 should prompt you immediately to look at line 3 and sort of use all your brain power in determining what could the problem be. Because PyCharm tells us that there's a colon expected, we don't have to use much brain power, but if you were using a different editor that maybe didn't tell you that, you just have to look at it carefully and make sure you haven't missed anything that Python would consider essential. In this case, it's a colon. So we can add our colon there, and then go back to our terminal and run pylint again. And now we get a few more errors. Notice that pylint runs through the Python file first, and it analyzes that. If you don't have valid syntax, like the missing semicolon, pylint cannot process the file and can't tell you what's wrong. So it only tells you syntax error if there's an invalid syntax, like proper, invalid Python code. But if you have valid Python code that's just, missing a few things, it will be able to do that. And now here you can see that it says 3 different things. it says it's missing a module docstring, the constant name app doesn't conform to the uppercase naming style, and also undefined variable Flask. So we can fix those three things. Let's go back and start with the first one, the missing module docstring. Every file in Python should, allegedly, according to pylint, have a small comment at the top that uses triple quotation marks explaining what this file is about. So we can write a short comment here explaining what app.py does. There we go. That was a bit more difficult than it should. And that's it. Now, if we go back to pylint and we run it again, you'll see that now we only get two things. Previously, our code had a score of -13. Now it has a score of -10, so we're getting better. Not very good, though. Now we've got constant name app doesn't conform to uppercase naming style, and we've got undefined variable Flask. The undefined variable Flask is substantially worse thing to have than a constant name app doesn't conform to uppercase naming style. As you can see, this here is a style thing. This here is a proper error. So we are going to go back and fix the missing variable Flask. Underneath the docstring, we can put from Flask, import Flask. Make sure you have Flask installed if you're going to copy along with me. But nonetheless, as you can see, this imports Flask. Now we don't have a undefined variable. We can go back to pylint and run it again. And now you can see that our code actually goes in the positive and we get 7.5 out of 10. This means that the code is going to run. And it will, as we've done in the past. But it says constant name app doesn't conform to uppercase naming style. Now, this is a style thing, so you don't have to do it. The same way as you don't have to add a docstring to your file. But what this is saying is, you're defining app, and then you're never doing, at any point in the rest of the file, app equals something. So you're never doing app equal anything else. That means that app is a constant that never changes. And in Python, constants are, by default, always named using all uppercase letters. So it would be something like this. Yeah? Then if we go back to pylint, we will get a 10 out of 10. It says, no problems, your code has been rated 10 out of 10, which is awesome, essentially. In Flask, this is actually not a very common thing to do. Normally, you would name your main app as app, in lowercase. But pylint doesn't quite like that. So just wanted to say that the style is, something that varies depending on the libraries you're using and the people you're working with and so forth. And also, you can name your variable as an all uppercase thing here. But if you potentially want to make changes, the linter doesn't know that. The linter doesn't know that in the future you're going to want to change this variable. So if you only have this code, it says, this is a constant, use all uppercase. If you then wanted in the future to make changes, like say app equals 5, this would now be sort of invalid style, right? You should have used lowercase letters. So the linter isn't all powerful and all seeing, it just makes recommendations. And often those recommendations are things you should really listen to. And especially if those recommendations are problems within your code that you have to fix, otherwise it won't run. But the style recommendations can sometimes be ignored if you prefer. Okay, notice that, a reminder, PyCharm has its own linter, so you don't have to use pylint if you are working with PyCharm, but some people like using other IDEs that maybe don't have such good error handling as PyCharm does, and in those cases, using pylint can be very useful. So that's it for this video. Just wanted to show you quickly how to use a linter in Python. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you on the next one. Hi and welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about yapf. Yapf is a Python formatter. In fact, it stands for yet another Python formatter, and it's used for things that a linter wouldn't really catch, but that are important still. For example, you've got here some code that I've written, and if you've been developing in Python for a while, you may see some things that are just a bit weird. For example, you've got a list here. This is fine. You've got 2 elements, and then you've got another element in a new line, which is maybe okay. And then you've got an element in a new line, but is less indented than the previous element. You've got a for loop here that has a colon this time, but then the body is on the same line. And this is okay in Python. It's just a bit strange. And then you've got a print statement that says we're done here, but it's using single quotation marks, and it's escaping another single quotation mark inside it. It would probably be better to use double quotation marks here instead. But hey, this is fine. This is Python code that actually works. We can run it and run at py, and you can see that things get printed out. So this is all okay. The linter wouldn't necessarily complain, although it would complain about the missing doc string. They always complain about that. But what about the format, right? Well, the format is also important. You want all the code within a project to have consistent format. The reason for that is so that as you go from one file to another, it looks the same. You're not encountering any jarring experiences that are a bit strange. And also, so that everybody working on the project, if you're working with more people, has the same standards of what a good style is, or what the style for the project is. That way, you're not going to sort of go from one file to another and be able to know who wrote it just from what the code looks like. Everybody should have a consistent style so that the code base is the same for everyone. And it doesn't feel, some files don't feel wrong to some people. For that, you have the formatters. The formatters, you can sort of customize them and tell them what style you want. And then all you do is you run your files through the formatter, and it will change the files such that they are still valid Python code, but they sort of rearrange the elements around to match a style that everyone in your team likes. So if we go back to the terminal, what you're going to do is, once again, you're going to do pip 3.6 or pip 3, depending on how many versions of Python you've got installed. Install yapf, yet another Python formatter. You're going to install that, and in my case, it's already installed, or possibly it was installed in a different Python version. And then all you have to do is run yapf and see if something happens. And what will happen normally with yapf is it'll just hang, which is not a very nice way of running a program. But because yapf needs a file to format, if you don't give it, I'm not really sure what it's doing, but it just seems to hang up. So if that happens, just press Control-C, and that'll terminate the program, and then you can run it again and give it the file that you want to format. And when you run that, it's going to give you the new file. So this is what the file should look like according to yapf. So you can see all the elements are in one line, and you've got a new line after the for loop. Notice that yapf has not changed the single quotation marks to double quotation marks, just because it's got an inner escaped quotation mark. So yapf hasn't really cared about that. And, I can get behind that. I think this is okay. But there are other formatters that would change that. So if you like this, then you can just do yapf-help, and it'll tell you the different options you can give yapf. So you can use -h or --help to bring this help message up. -v or --version to see what version of yapf you've got. Then you've got -d or --diff. Either of these two options is valid to print out the difference between your local file and the file that yapf is creating. And you've got another one, recursive, in place, and so forth. And really the one we're interested in is the in place. This is going to make changes to the file. So if we do yapf-i app.py, nothing seems to happen. But when we go back to PyCharm, you can see that the file has changed. Now we've got everything in one line, and this is in 2 lines. If you do decide to use PyCharm, PyCharm comes with its own formatter. So if we do this, you'll see that PyCharm actually tells us that, you're doing something a bit weird here. pep8, continuation line under-indented for visual indent. The fact that it says visual indent means that this isn't a required indent in Python. It's just a visual thing, and it tells you, according to pep8, which is the sort of style guide for Python, this is a strange thing to do. And it also tells you here, pep8, multiple statements in one line. So the for is one statement, the print is another statement, and it's telling you you shouldn't do this. And also, by the way, you can then put a semicolon and put more statements in there if you want, and it's going to tell you again, this is not something you want to do. This is not something a lot of people know about Python. You can use semicolons in Python as well, just like you can in Java and JavaScript, to separate multiple statements in one line, but it's a bit weird. What you can do in PyCharm, though, is you can select everything, and then you can go to Code, and you can go to Reformat Code, and it'll format it if it can. So once again, that reformat code, and that'll do what it can. I'm not sure what auto indent lines is going to do. Nothing. So as you can see, it didn't quite fix this problem here. And that's because depending on the formatter, it will consider some things to be fixable. Sort of, if you do this, pretty much any formatter will tell you you're definitely doing something you don't want to do there. But if you do this, in some cases, you may want to do this. In this case, PyCharm's formatter doesn't change it for you. Yapf does. So that's just a difference between formatters, and there are ways of customizing the formatters. Yapf can be customized, and I'm not sure if PyCharm's probably can be customized too, actually, to make it change it if you want. We're not going to go into that in this course, though. That's for something for you to investigate if you want to customize it more to your needs. But of course, the little gray lines in PyCharm still tell you when you're doing something a bit strange, and in this case, you can just fix it manually if you want. So that's it. That's how you use the PyCharm formatter and also yapf. And I'm going to put another link to another formatter that is up and coming called Black, that is more strict, if you wish. It will change more things, but allegedly for a nicer end experience. So I'll put a link on that in the lecture so you can give it a go if you want. That's it for this video though. Hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you on the next one. Hi and welcome back. In this video we're going to look at sending emails. Sending emails with Python can be done in multiple ways. The simplest way, though, is you can send email by using your personal email account. For example, if you have a Gmail account, you can send emails using that account and Python. Something you may not know is that emails all go, or the majority of them go through something called SMTP. SMTP is a protocol, very much like HTTP is, used to communicate between two different things. In this case, we're going to use SMTP to communicate between our Python code and the Gmail servers, and we're going to tell Gmail servers to log in using our Gmail account and send an email. So let's create a new Python file that I'm going to call email_smtplib.py, and we're going to start sending email. It's actually really straightforward when you have all the code together. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to import smtplib. smtplib comes with Python, and it's used to talk to an SMTP server. Gmail servers are SMTP servers, and you can communicate with them directly by using this library. Okay. So what we're going to do is we are going to start off by connecting to the SMTP server. What we're going to do is we're going to do SMTP connector is smtplib.smtp, and in here we're going to pass in a host name that is going to be smtp.gmail.com for the Gmail servers. If you're using a different server like Hotmail or Yahoo or anything else, make sure to figure out the SMTP server and also the port name. That for Gmail is 587. Okay, this is normally the port for SMTP servers, 587. So make sure to figure out what the host name is and what the port is. Then we're going to do smtp connector.startTLS, and this just starts a secure connection to it. In some cases, TLS won't be required to connect to your SMTP server, so in those cases you won't have to do this. And then smtp connector.login. And we're going to give him our email account, you@gmail.com, and our password. Of course, I'm not going to type out my email and password here. I hope you understand that. But nonetheless, that is all you have to do. Now, it is possible that when you press play, for example, if we press play right now, we will of course get an error. In this case, username and password not accepted. If you type in your username, email account, and your password correctly, you may still get an error. And that will happen, of course, if you're using two-factor authentication. If you're using two-factor authentication, you'll need to get a special type of password that your provider will give you, which is called an app password normally. So I'm going to add a wee doc string here at the top of the file to say that. Okay, so if you get an SMTP authentication error, even when your password is correct, it's possible that you have two-factor authentication enabled, and you'll have to use an app password to log in instead of your normal password. Now, particularly in the case of Gmail, there is something else. That if you don't have two-factor authentication enabled, you'll have to allow access by less secure apps in Gmail. Your app here that logs in with your username and password directly is what Gmail classifies as a less secure app. So through your Gmail security preferences, you can enable less secure apps so that you can test this out. And of course, remember to deactivate less secure apps once you finish learning about sending email. Okay. If you use an app password or you enable less secure apps and you don't have 2FA enabled, this should work and you shouldn't get any errors. But of course, we don't have an email that we're sending yet. We haven't written anything to send. So we can do that. We're going to use the email module that is present in Python 3. We're going to say from email message, import email message. This email message class is a way of constructing an email message very easily. So we'll create a new email message object, and then we'll just set the subject to be something like test email, the from to be your email, you@gmail.com, and the to be whoever you want to send an email to. This email will actually go to someone, so feel free to send an email to someone you know. Preferably don't send them to me. I could get quite a lot of emails if we do that, but you can send them to someone else at gmail.com. Okay? Then you're going to do email.setContent, and here you can type in some text content that the email will contain. What you'll normally do in these cases when you want to set the content of an email, if it's simple content, you will at some point here create something called email content and use a multi-line string to say something like, "Dear sir / madam, I am sending you an email with Python. I hope you like it. Kind regards, me." And then you can just set the email content like that. Now you've got your email and you've got your connection to the SMTP server. All you have to do is say smtp connector.sendMessage and your email object that we created up here, and that has all our headers, subject, from, and to, and the content. And then remember to quit the SMTP connector as well. That closes the connection to your account, and all is good. This is all you need to send an email using your personal account, as well as taking care of the security concerns of your email provider. Of course, for many apps, as soon as you release them and you sort of put them out there, give them to your users to use, you don't really want to be sending email with your personal account. So, a stopgap can be to create another Gmail account that is for your business. But Gmail doesn't really like that. So, what we normally do, instead of using smtplib, which is a way to send, a few emails, what we do instead normally if we want to send a lot of emails is we use an email sending service. There are a couple of them like Mailgun or SendGrid, and in this course we're going to be looking at Mailgun in order to be sending email to a larger scale of users. So this is how you can send email with smtplib to send small amounts of emails using your personal account. In the next video we're going to look at using Mailgun. I'll see you there. Hi and welcome back. In this video we're going to look at Mailgun. Mailgun is one of a family of email sending services. And Mailgun in particular I like because it's really straightforward to use and it's not, the most powerful email sending service in the world, but it sort of does everything you need to send simple emails using Python or indeed any other programming language. Now, if you want to send an email using Mailgun to anyone in the world, you need to have a domain name. For example, mailgun.com is a domain name, and tecladocode.com is a domain name. If you don't have a domain name, you can still go through this lecture and learn about using Mailgun, but you'll only be able to send emails to yourself. So that's just something to take into consideration. If you don't have a domain, the assumption is you don't have people who want to receive your emails or who have signed up to receive your emails yet. So that's why they don't let you send emails to people if you haven't got a domain name registered with Mailgun. So what we're going to do in order to learn about sending emails with Mailgun is we're going to first sign up. Now, to sign up is free and it takes 57 seconds allegedly. I'm sure it takes longer than that. But here, all you want to do is, fill in the details. You will not need to add payment info now if you want, at least not at the time of recording, and you want to stick to the free plan, okay? If you add payment info, it's going to put you on the pay-as-you-go plan, which means in the unlikely event that you do a infinite loop of sending emails, you will have to pay. So best thing to do, don't add payment info if you don't want to pay, and that'll keep you in the free plan, and you won't be able to go over it. So in case you make something wrong, nothing bad will happen, okay? So you fill in your details, click I'm not a robot, and then you will have your account. Now let's go over to what happens when you have an account already. When you log into Mailgun, you'll be received with something that looks more or less like this. A couple of things may be different because I have a domain that I've added to Mailgun already, and you won't have that, but nonetheless, you'll have a sort of dashboard. If you go over to your domains list, you'll have a sandbox domain, such as this one. And with a sandbox domain, you can only send emails to the email you signed up with. So in my case, that's up here on the right, jose@schoolofcode.me. This is an old account, no longer use School of Code. If you're interested in our stuff, it's tecladocode now, .com, in fact. So this sandbox domain, you can click on it, and you'll be received with some things here. And default SMTP login, and this is the email account that you can use using SMTP. You've got an API base URL, you've got a password, and you've got an API key. So the SMTP login and the password are used to log in via SMTP, as we saw in the last couple of videos. 2 videos ago? Yeah. I think so. Or last video. Nonetheless, when you were sending emails using Gmail, you can instead swap that for this default SMTP login and default password, and you can send emails using SMTP using these two things. The other option is to go on a more Pythonic scale and use the API. Using the API is pretty straightforward. All you need to do is install requests and run a API request. So we're going to look at using that in this video. Okay, now in the authorized recipients, you're going to want to add your own email. So this is actually quite new. It used to be you could only send to your own email, but it seems that now is a new thing. So you can invite yourself in there, invite recipient, and I'm guessing I'll get an email saying, hey, confirm you want to be emailed by this guy, and we're going to say yes. So if that's the case, sorry about the misinformation earlier. This is the new way to do it, apparently, which is good. And that's it. So all you need, now that you've invited your authorized recipients, is get the API-based URL and the API key. Remember these details and go over to PyCharm, where we will continue setting up this and sending emails using Mailgun. So let's go over to PyCharm. After we copy this, we're going to put Mailgun API URL is going to be this, and Mailgun API key is going to be this key. There you have it. Now we have our two different values here. What we need is also a way to store who the emails are coming from, who they're going to, and sort of the subject and the content of the email. Okay, so from name is going to be Jose in this case. From email is going to be Jose at schoolofcode.me. To emails, and this is going to be a list of emails, is going to be another email, another at gmail.com. And you can put multiple emails there if you want, so you can send emails to more than one person. The subject is going to be test email for me, and the content is just going to be a simple content. Hello, this is a test email. Okay, now we've got all our data. And notice how these are all constants in Python. And constants in Python are always uppercase, and that just means we're not going to change them. Then all we have to do is import requests. So we're going to do import requests. If you don't have it installed, just install it in the environment that you're using for this project. And then we do requests.post. And here it goes. We're going to put Mailgun API URL. This is where the request is going to go to. Then we've got an auth variable here, and the auth variable is a tuple. So the first element of the tuple is API, and the second one is the API key. Okay, so there's a tuple there. And all this says is the request is going to go through with some data to the API URL, and in that data is going to contain this authentication data. And this is called basic auth. This is basic auth. And essentially it just contains sort of a key and a value, and they can identify you with this value here. It's not terribly secure, it's not the most secure way of doing things, but it is basic and simple. And then we're going to have a data dictionary. And in this dictionary, we're going to have a from, which is going to be the from email. Then we are going to have a to, that is going to be to emails. We're going to have a subject, that is going to be the subject, and text, that is going to be the content. Now, where is from name used? Well, this from is actually not meant to be just an email. It's meant to be a f string that contains the from name and then from email here as well. Okay, now we've got here the name and the email is coming from, and this format, I'm sure you've seen it before, like when you get an email through, I'm not going to say legacy system, but something like Outlook or something like that. Normally it's like Rolf Smith, and it's like Rolf Smith at example.net. So yeah, it's normally in this format, and this is the format we're replicating here as well. And Mailgun understands that, and it allows us to give a name to the sender, so that when somebody receives it, they'll see who it's coming from as opposed to just an email. Okay, I'm going to put this in the same line just because that looks a bit nicer to me. And that's it. Once the authorized recipient is successfully authorized, you can run this and it'll send a request to the Mailgun API URL. It'll authenticate you with your API key, and then it'll send this data over, and they will do all the hard work of constructing the email, making sure it's sent, and of course it's really simple to put this in a function and make it take a few parameters, and very easily you can send email to multiple people. So normally when I am making a new Flask application and I want to send emails, all I do is honestly this, I put it in a function, and then I call that function from multiple parts of my application, and it's really simple to send emails that way. We're going to look over the next couple of videos at how to sort of organize this email sending method a bit nicely, and that way you can reuse it in your applications if you want. So that's it. Try it out. Let me know if it works. And hopefully you enjoyed learning about sending emails using Mailgun. The same method, by the way, or a very similar one, will apply for other email sending providers like SendGrid. That's it for this video. I'll see you on the next one. Hi and welcome back. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can reuse your Mailgun sending code just by putting it inside a library file and calling it from your other code. So this is just a refactoring of this code here to make it a bit nicer, but nonetheless, I thought I should show you how I do this normally in my other projects. It's really straightforward. What we'll do is in your project, you'll want to have a new Python package that you're going to call libs. And normally you'll have a package like this one in most projects as long as you're using other external services. In this case, we're using the external service Mailgun. Mailgun gives us an API that we can interact with, but there is a small issue of sorts that here we're not really, in terms of our code, we're not really interacting with Mailgun directly. When you read this code, it's a bit too raw. You know, you can see that what you're doing is you're making a request to some API and then something's happening and so forth. And unless you know exactly what this API is doing, it may not be immediately obvious that this is sending an email. Of course, you now know what this code does, and if you see a post request to something called Mailgun, you know what Mailgun is, and you see a from, to, subject, and text, you can probably guess this is sending an email. But what I mean to say is that this code here isn't what you'd read as send an email. You'd read this as make a post request to some place. So it's always a good idea to put this code inside a function and call that function send an email. And that way, when you read in some other part of your program send email, you'll know that that function is sending an email, and you won't have to worry about whether it's sending a post request or a get request to some place. So with that said, we'll go into our libs folder and create a new Python file. I'm going to call this mailgun.py because this is going to contain our Mailgun library. This is going to be a Python file that is going to encapsulate that sending of a request, and it's going to encapsulate it and call it in a bit nicer way. So we're going to import requests in here. Then we're going to have our class Mailgun, and this class Mailgun is going to have a few properties: an API URL, API key, and also a from name and from email. So we're going to paste those in here. Now, the assumption for this class is that these are all static properties. They're never going to change. And so we can just set and hardcode the values in here. This may not be true for your project. Maybe you'll want to be sending emails from different people. And in that case, you'll want to restructure this slightly. And I'll show you how in just a moment. Then we're going to have a class method in here that I'm going to call send email. And this is going to get 3 arguments: the emails that you want to send an email to, the subject, and the content. Okay? And then what we're going to do is we're going to copy this requests.post, and instead of Mailgun API URL, we're going to do cls.mailgun API URL. Instead of Mailgun API key, we're going to do cls.mailgun API key. And instead of 2 emails as a constant, we're going to do 2 emails. The parameter subject is also going to be the parameter, and content is also going to be the parameter. And of course, from name and from email should also be inside CLS. That's it. We're going to remove this comment here. Let's assume we already know what that does. And really, that's everything you need. You put in here your API URL and your API key, and you can hardcode your name and your email that you're sending from. If you don't want to hardcode them because your application requires sending from different places, just add them as arguments here. From name, from email. And if you want, you could even make these constant variables by default. Make sure to use the right thing here. But because my applications normally have a single email that it's sending the emails, I normally don't do this. But you could do it and then just replace them here as well. And that would be a way of making this a bit more flexible. That's it. You have your Mailgun class that can send emails. Now, when you want to send an email anywhere within your application, all you have to do is say mailgun.send email and give it the email subject and content. So we're going to create a new file inside the project, and I'm going to call that using mailgun lib.py. And this is going to do just from libs Mailgun, import Mailgun class, and then we're going to do Mailgun send email, and this is going to go to test@gmail.com. The subject is going to be something like test email, and the content is going to be this is a test email. It could be anything you want. That's it. You can now send emails. What's this saying? Of course, I've put the list in there. We don't want to put the list there. This is the emails that this email is going to. In this case, it's just a single guy or woman. This is the title or the subject, and this is the content. If you want to call this a bit nicer, you can say to emails is that. You can then say subject is that. And you can then say content is that. So that's just calling it a bit nicer. It's up to you what you do, of course. Normally, I think I would do it this way, just because it's pretty clear that the email is going to go to this email. And then you may want to put subject and content here, just to make sure that nobody gets confused. Maybe they think this is the content, this is the subject. If you call them with named arguments, that's just a little bit clearer, maybe a bit nicer way of doing that. Whenever you want to send an email from your application, all you have to do is call your Mailgun library send email function, or method, sorry, and that'll send an email. So this is a bit of a nicer way of structuring your email sending, and this is actually what I use very often, a library just like this one, in many other projects. There is an issue with security if you put your API key inside your code. You don't want to put your API key inside your code if you're going to share that code with other people, but that is a bit more of an advanced concept, how you're going to secure your code if you're going to share with people and so forth. Not something we're going to cover in this course. But there are ways of doing that. It's just a little bit more advanced, and you have to worry about sharing your code with other people first before you start worrying about security. That's it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed structuring this application in a bit of a nicer way, and I'll see you on the next video. Hi and welcome back. In this video, as we're approaching the end of the course, I wanted to show you a bit more how I work on my day-to-day. What you've seen so far is me working with a setup that is, I think, quite good for recording. But you've not seen the actual way that I work at my computer every day. So I thought it may be interesting to show you how I go about doing my job, just in case you want to replicate some of these things if you find them interesting. Now, normally, you'll see me and many other software engineers coding with a dark theme. This is a white theme, and right now it's getting a bit late. You can see the time up on the top right. It's 8:30 at night. Using a white theme at this time of the day is actually not the nicest thing to use. So I normally use a dark theme, and I find it's just a bit more readable. And also I just find the colors, I said that very weirdly, I find the colors pop a bit more. So things like keywords and things like that are just a bit more visible when you're using a dark theme. So what I normally do is I have a different theme. Now you can see that the theme here is default in PyCharm when you open the settings and you go to appearance. I normally use in PyCharm a darkular theme. So you can apply that, and then you can see immediately that we have sort of changed quite a bit. We are now in a dark mode. You can see the font has changed as well, and you probably can't see it as well because it's much smaller. Of course, when I'm recording, I use a huge font, just so you guys can see it very easily. But when I'm working, I don't use a huge font like that. But let's go over to the preferences once again, and I'll show you what I do use in the editor and in font. So in the color scheme here, you can see that I've got my own custom scheme, which is called Darkular Jose. That's just for me. And in here, I've overridden quite a few things. In code, possibly. Let me go and find it again. Font here. Oh, there you go. Color scheme font. I'm using, frequently I use a font called Essential Pragmata Pro. That depends, or whether I use this font or not, depends on the size of my screen. So I don't actually use PyCharm all that often when I'm working at this computer. I use it all the time at work. But when I'm working at this computer at home, I've stopped using PyCharm a bit more just because it's a bit too heavy duty for the things I do when I'm in my free time. So if I'm using a small screen, like a laptop, which I frequently do, I'll use Essential Pragmata Pro. Essential Pragmata Pro is a paid font, but I find it really readable when it's small, and also because it's a skinny font, it is taller than it is wide. It is very good for a small screen. You can fit more characters on a small screen, and you can still read it nicely. So Essential Pragmata Pro, paid font, but very nice for small screens. When I'm using a larger screen, like I am doing right now for recording, I would actually not use Essential Pragmata Pro, I would use Fira Code. So this is the font I use normally on my day-to-day when I am at home. So if we apply that, you can see that it looks a bit different. Now, one of the reasons I've stopped using PyCharm at home is because it's too heavy-duty. And another reason is that this font looks just a little bit weird in my eyes. The spacing between the letters is a bit too much. And in PyCharm, you cannot actually change that, which is a little bit annoying. PyCharm does have the tendency of adding too much space between letters. So I'll go into in a moment into what I do to avoid that. So this is the font that I normally use. Feel free to use that. Fira Code is a free font. You can download it and you can use it. It's up to you. One of the good things about Fira Code is the font ligatures. So if you want to enable them, just press Enable Font Ligatures and then you can press OK. And then you'll get a few things that change in the font. For example, if you type equal greater than, you'll get this little arrow instead of two separate symbols. Similarly, if you type greater than or equal to in Python, so that's these two characters together, you get this mathematical symbol for greater than or equal to. So I quite like these symbols. Some people don't like them. So Fira Code does that for you if you enable the font ligatures. And if that's something you want to do, you can use this font as well. And the other things are the language defaults, sort of the colors for things. And I've modified some of these colors so that keywords are orange. I just find they pop much more easily and they're very readable like that. And of course, a few other changes here as well, like the underlines and so forth. Feel free to change these to match your own style and what you like as well. It took me quite a while to find a color scheme for PyCharm that I really liked, but I've actually not changed this one in a long time. So I do like it, but PyCharm adds a bit too much spacing between letters, so normally I would use the other font, Essential Pragmata Pro, on particularly a small screen if I was using PyCharm. But at home, I am not using PyCharm anymore, and I'm also not using Essential Pragmata Pro, really, because I have two large screens. And so I'm using Visual Studio Code that actually you can see just here. Here are my notes for the last few lectures. You can see that I've got a split screen there. And here I'm using Fira Code as well, with also a dark theme, quite a nice theme here. And this is what I normally code in when I'm working on course material or small applications like I do at home. I use Visual Studio Code. I find it's quite straightforward to use. And I also use Visual Studio Code at work when I'm working on JavaScript applications, just because it works very nicely for that. And I find just the structure of JavaScript applications and the use of Fira Code helps with that. Using Fira Code and PyCharm can be a bit more tricky because of the letter spacing. So that's it. In terms of the settings in Visual Studio Code, I have a few extensions installed, and you can see them here. I have a bunch of them, but really the most important ones for me are ESLint, which integrates a linter into JavaScript code, very much like pylint for Python. You've got ESLint for JavaScript. You've got Flow language, which adds types to JavaScript. And then you've got a few other things here that may be more interesting to you, like Jinja, which allows us to look at Jinja code, which is used in Flask. I've got Python, which is an extension that allows you to write Python code, and it adds things like linting, debugging, and so forth into Visual Studio Code, which is very useful. And also something I do like is VS Code icons. When you go back to your Explorer here, that's what it's called, you can see little icons beside the files, and that just sort of helps identify them a bit nicer. I generally like the look of Visual Studio Code a bit more than I do of PyCharm, but the PyCharm debugger is much more powerful than anything I've managed to use in Visual Studio Code. So when I'm working in Python, I use PyCharm because of the debugger almost exclusively. When I'm working in JavaScript, because the debugging capabilities are much worse, it doesn't really matter which one I use, so I tend to prefer Visual Studio Code. And that's it. Visual Studio Code also gives you a few nice things, like it's a pretty nice search. The Git source control is quite powerful and quite nice to use. And then it's got a debugger as well, but as I said, with JavaScript it's not so fantastic, so I tend not to use it all that often. The theme, I think, is called... I'm not sure what it's called, actually, but I will put a wee link to the sort of settings that I'm using here, just in case you want to give it a go as well. Down here in Visual Studio Code, you've also got a terminal, so you don't have to open a separate application, and frequently I use this terminal here to do things, like run my Python apps or my linter or whatever. So it's pretty nice to have that in here as well. Anyway, that's it for this video. Just wanted to show you what I normally work with, and paired with these two programs that I use for software development, I also use, of course, Slack as a communication tool to talk with my teammates, and that's pretty much always running, and of course email as well to do wider company updates and things like that. That's it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you on the next one.